Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate everybody showing up and taking the time out of your busy schedules just to be in attendance for such an important conversation here at the universities. I have myself and Dr. White Eagle who are hosting this event, talking about tribal sovereignty in higher education and what that means to support Native students, especially whenever you're trying to build out programming, right, in higher ed. I met Nora and Heather at NCORE this past May, and they brought this conversation to NCORE. They presented it actually, and I thought it was really amazing and really insightful and educational. And I wanted to bring that here to the Auraria campus. And so that's why we're here today. And I'm going to go ahead and let Nora and Heather introduce themselves. Sorry, NCORE is a national conference of, somebody help me out.
National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education.
Yes, there we go. All the acronyms, sorry.
So I guess I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Yat e she Nora Polskamp Yanishe, Tsitna Jini e Nishle, Bilgan e Bashishchi, Tolchini Dashin Shiche, and Bilgana e Dashinali. Hodai Astana Nishle. My name is Nora Polskamp. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. I'm from the Black Streaked Wood clan, which is sister clans with the mini goats. And I'm currently the director of Native student programs at the University of Redlands. I've been working in Native higher education for over 20 years. I'm getting up there now, so it feels like I can just estimate now for over 20 years. I'm not going to count every year anymore. But yeah, I've had the privilege of being able to work with my community in addressing the needs in higher education for that time. And I feel really lucky to be able to do that. And I'm here with Heather, who I've known for quite some time as well. And we've been colleagues together in a few different locations. So I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself.
Thanks, Nora. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Torres. I'm an enrolled member of the San Alfonso Pueblo and a descendant of the Navajo Nation. I'm also Mexican, and I use she, her pronouns. I was born and raised in Southern California. I'm Zooming to you today from a work conference that we're having in Palm Springs, California. The homelands of the Cahuilla, particularly the Agua Caliente Band, whose reservation is here in Palm Springs. They kind of got a checkerboarded situation going on here in the city. And I have known Nora for a long time now and have worked and learned from her in the area of higher education and American Indian and Alaska Native access, retention, recruitment. Nora's my mom. I like to say we met when I was an undergraduate student at UCLA, and I was paired with her in a mentorship family relationship through the Retention of American Indians Now project at UCLA, which is still running. And it's a student-run and student-initiated project. I currently work at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute as program director. We're a national training and technical assistance provider for tribes, for non-Native organizations as well that are doing work with tribes in a lot of areas ranging from tribal law, tribal court development to child welfare program and victim service program development. So I'm here today in my personal capacity, and I'm so excited to be able to share this with you all and to have made that connection with Desiree at NCORE and the Native Caucus. So thank you so much again for the invitation.
So we just wanted to kind of give you a brief overview of some of the takeaways that we're going to hopefully cover during our presentation. The first is a better understanding of tribal sovereignty, as that's the title of the lecture. How tribal identities are related to but are different from racial identities, which is a really important distinction to make. And how higher education institutions do or do not recognize tribal sovereignty in the different ways that may appear at your institution. And then also how to interrogate practice to better recognize tribal sovereignty.
Dang, I pressed it too softly. I was all confident in my unmuting abilities. And just to outline, a rough outline of the agenda to meet those outcomes, we're going to talk about what is tribal sovereignty, do a brief history of Native higher education in the United States, talk about how universities or institutions are trying to recognize tribal sovereignty and kind of interrogate those ways, and then also talk through some examples and discussion. And with that, I definitely wanted to give folks a be at the ready. If you have your phones or are joining us on Zoom and can easily access your web browser, we're going to be using a program called Mentimeter to be able to do some audience engagement live. So what you'll do is there's some instructions there up on the screen where you can visit. You can either visit menti.com and input the code, or you can scan the QR code with your phone and join the survey that way. And as you can see, the answers populate. So our first question is, who's in the room? So we can get oriented with each other.
Yeah, and we're, Heather and I had the ability to do this in person at NCORE, and we really fed a lot off of the energy in the room. So it's a little bit hard to do that via Zoom. So we encourage everyone to submit questions in the chat. I don't know if there's the ability to jump in and ask questions, but we'll try to check those during the course of our presentation. We're not trying to push everything to the end and have a designated question time. But please feel free to jump in and put some comments and questions in the chat. But there should be 2 questions. The first is just, who's here? What's your position on campus? And then the second is your comfortability with talking about tribal sovereignty. And that should come up automatically on your end, but it'll be the next slide for us. So it looks like we got a good number. We have about 20 people in here. A little bit less than half of them are students, some staff. 1 faculty member, yeah, and some administrators. Let's see. All right.
I want to just quickly point out, we do have the dean for the university's largest college. John is here, which I think is a really important point because we have so much of the programming in LAS. So thank you, John, for coming.
Yeah, it's great to see, upper administration attend events like this. I wish that was happening at other campuses as well more often. So how confident are you in your ability to discuss tribal sovereignty? So we have a couple that are very confident, and then a good spread across the board. Which is really good. We want to make this accessible for everybody. So please, I think Desiree mentioned the anti-vibes and the humor. So we do try to make this a little bit easier to kind of interact with us about this. I know sometimes people are afraid to ask questions or make comments, and we want to bring that up. Feel free to say things and ask questions. And if you don't know, if you need more explanation, just let us know. So quite a few neutral, and then we got almost the bell curve going.
Almost, yeah. And if anyone would like to share, why they rated themselves a particular level on this scale, that'd be great, because I think there's some we joked that our audience at large conferences, or even just at our events, right, are often Native people and we don't often get non-Native folks attending our events and such. So we thought maybe our results would be skewed at our NCORE conference presentation, and here we're seeing a more variety. So if anyone feels comfortable sharing about why you rated yourself a particular way, or if there's a question that comes to mind immediately, please feel free to share that in the chat, or share it live for our folks that are there in the room.
Does anybody want to share why they answered what they answered?
And no need to call yourself out. You don't got to say, "Oh, I rated myself neutral." You could just explain your.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Brianna. I'm a Apache and Ute, and I rated myself somewhat confident. I mean, for me, learning about Indigenous culture and my own culture as a Native person, it's always an ongoing thing. I mean, in school, we know that there's a lack of Native education. So coming to stuff like this, I'm always able to gain more knowledge. I like to be able to say I'm an advocate to share my knowledge with other people that aren't Native or don't have the same knowledge, but that's why I'm here, to learn about it. So I don't want to speak up too much and be like, oh, with too much confidence. I'm just here to learn, gain the knowge.
Be all humble, huh?
I was just going to say, #humble.
Would anyone else like to share?
I'll share. My name is Lillian Minigoats. So I put somewhat confident because I'm not too sure if tribal sovereignty has evolved or changed in some capacity as to what I was familiar with, what tribal sovereignty actually is. It could be more components. It could just be a very vague title. So that's why I put somewhat confident.
Yeah, there's always room to learn. Even, for Native people, the way that we engage with our own tribal sovereignty and how we exercise the rights of tribal sovereignty is vastly different. So we will see varying degrees of comfortability. So we will, so thank you for participating in the surveys. It really does help us give us an idea of just, who we're speaking to, and kind of what to expect and where we should kind of fill in more information as we go forward. So we'll get right into, what is tribal sovereignty? So Heather, what is tribal sovereignty?
That's a fun one. And our folks that already just shared some of their answers around where they rated themselves on that scale, I think got at a lot of the questions. Like, it is often a vague term. It's often a broad term. Folks, including large political leadership players, often don't know its confines or its scope or its definition. And kind of just throw it out there, right? And so in that vein, we wanted to start off by sharing, and I apologize if folks are having trouble in the chat. Just let us know if there's any way that we can help with that. But we wanted to start off with just, what do you think of when you hear the word sovereignty? If folks can throw some things out there to kind of get our bearings around how we orient ourselves to that word.
This is Taylor, and for me, I think it means a lot about self-governance and independence, and that's what rings true for me with that language.
Great.
This is Shayla. I think about independence a lot. I think about sovereignty.
I think for a lot of people, it evokes feelings of like royalty, right? Or like monarchy. Also, I've heard folks share before some sort of regal connotation.
I think more recently too, there's been these sovereign citizens that have become more prevalent. People have heard those phrases thrown out.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that recently, and I'm like, what? Like, what is that about? And then I'm like, okay, but I don't know. And then it just leads into the conversation again, and of like being treated as invisible, right? And like there is like tribal sovereignty, and a lot of people don't like really interconnect the two or see that there's a complete distinction between the two, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the common uses of the word I think can really muddy the waters for people to understand tribal sovereignty. So I know Heather, had this kind of brought up as a second question. So does the tribal sovereignty change your understanding?
Are there any distinctions that you think come up, or do you think, or do you think that but I think with this group, you've said self-governance, independence. I imagine there's probably not a lot of change. I see this a lot in my work as well when we think about, tribal courts or tribal codes or tribal law. Folks are like, wow, tribes have their own laws? Tribes have their own courts? And then when they find that out, sometimes they don't mean to, but sometimes they do. There's that sense of like inferiority, or that it's not a real court or it's not a real law. And I think when we talk about, for some folks, when tribal sovereignty comes up, I think one distinction that might come up for folks is like it's special somehow, and special rights, which again, like Nora said, kind of muddies the waters and takes the focus off the political relationship that is the origin of this relationship that we have, tribal nations have with, and tribal people have with the United States. Thank you all for sharing.
So we have a little clip to share. And this is just to let everyone know that, if you weren't super comfortable, if you were one of the people who said that you were not super confident to discussing tribal sovereignty,
Here we
it's okay.
play the questioning by Mark Trehant. He is the editorial page editor of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, former president of the Native American Journalists Association, questioning President Bush.
Most school kids learn about government in the context of city, county, state, and federal. And of course, tribal governments are not part of that at all. Mr. President, you've been a governor and a president, so you have a unique experience looking at it from two directions. What do you think tribal sovereignty means in the 21st century? And how do we resolve conflicts between tribes and the federal and state governments?
Yeah. Tribal sovereignty means that. It's sovereign. I mean, you've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity.
Okay.
And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereign entities.
I hope everyone was able to hear that.
That was perfect. Someone wrote, just wow.
Yeah, so even, the leaders of our own country sometimes don't quite know what tribal sovereignty is, or what their part in tribal sovereignty is.
Now, given the kind of brief discussion we had about, and this slide is good, Nora, about sovereignty, tribal sovereignty. Is there anything that sticks out? There's a lot of things to pick at in that video, but is there anything that sticks out from that clip of former President Bush there trying to explain the relations between sovereign entities?
Honestly, when I saw it was George W. Bush, I thought it was going to be a lot worse. That was pretty articulate for GW. I think the highest executive officer in the country should probably have some sense for the legal foundations of tribal sovereignty and inability to look at the Marshall Trilogy cases and talk about retained sovereignty via Worcester v. Georgia. Lacking that, which clearly President Bush was and likely still is, some basic understanding of where those rights come from would be comforting to hear, I suspect, for many of us. But yeah, I think the grounding in case law is really important.
Yeah, thank you. And Mark Trahant, the journalist that was asking the question, really made the distinction that he served at two levels of political leadership, right? He served at the state level and at the federal level. And so what does it mean for states and state relationships with tribes as well? So I think it really underscores the egregious nature of his misunderstanding of tribal sovereignty, given not only his status as the former president or president at the time, and then but also in state leadership. And I think one of the biggest things that stands out for me in terms of what he got wrong in that clip is that he says they've been given sovereignty. And I think that is just the core to a core misunderstanding. It kind of has that same connotation of that same narrative that folks try and spew when they try to say tribal people have special rights. And so here with tribal sovereignty, it really is just the inherent political authority to govern. It's there, and it's inherent, it's within, and it's not something that's given. And what we've got on the slide for you is a resource to share. It's a really short video from the Native Governance Center that you might want to take a look at yourself or use in your classes or discussions. But really, that is what sovereignty is. It's a simple concept, but it becomes complicated by the way different folks are using it, right? Another way to look at this as well is that these decisions, laws, systems that are created by this inherent political power are maintained without interference historically. And that's where we get to really dig into tribal and federal relationships, because the United States government has done nothing but interfere with tribal sovereignty. So a key takeaway for anyone attending today: it's the inherent political authority to govern. Tribes inherently have this power. It is not something that's been given or granted by the United States, by states, etc., any other form of government. It's within themselves.
I think this is especially important when we start thinking about tribes that are not federally recognized, who have maintained their identity as tribes. They've maintained the way that they identify who is and who isn't part of that group. Their sovereignty, as Heather mentioned, is inherent. It's something that has been there since the beginning of time, and it continues to be there whether or not the United States recognizes it officially. And there are many tribes that have pushed to regain their federal recognition or to be seen officially through the United States lens as sovereign nations.
We do have a comment in the room.
Yeah, I was just this Manda. I noticed that one thing I took from that video was the lack of education. I noticed that he mentions at the beginning when he's asking the question, like, we're learning in schools about the federal government and all that stuff. And coming from my point of view of like just coming into this in my 30s and having to learn about it, I'm just astonished about how like I've never learned about any of this in my schooling. Like it fell off in my family. And not only that, like just seeing how he responded, I was like, I can get why it could be offensive, but from my point of view, I'm like, it just shows how much information is not taught to anybody, to even like him, who should know about it, if that makes sense.
No, that's a fantastic point. And I think this actually is the perfect image to kind of go with your comment here, is that, when we're learning in school about various governments, the focus is really on the federal government and the state government, really, right? We get a little bit into local and county exposure in maybe a civics course or something, but we don't really talk about tribal nations as contemporary governments, right? It's very much in the past tense. It's very much of a time like, oh, that was back in the day when tribes were governing themselves, and now the United States is here, and we don't need to talk about contemporary tribal governments. That tribes are very much still nations operating their own systems of governance, of care. So we pulled this image here. I believe it's from the Domestic Policy Center to just really highlight that we don't really get to talk about tribal governments in the same ways that we talk about federal and state government. That's why so many folks are still blown away when they're like, oh, tribes have their own laws. I should pay attention when I'm driving through the reservation, like what those tribes' laws are. And even we do talk about foreign governments, right? There's dedicated world history courses. There's these dedicated conversations to external sovereigns, but we really do overlook in the American education system, tribal government, and tribal nationhood. And so I thought these were striking, putting them this way. Folks might be very familiar with the image on the right, as the image that we see when we start discussing manifest destiny, and those types of concepts in U.S. history courses and other things. On the left, you'll see an image in a painting called Reversing Manifest Destiny, as a talk back to this more historical image. And so I wanted to put these up in contrast because I think it really shows that since time immemorial, tribes have been operating their own distinct systems of care, governance, relationality, and colonization is the process that effectively disrupted tribes' exercise or full exercise of sovereignty. And so in order to colonize this place and create the United States, right, that meant that there was active violence against people, against the land, and against tribal values, worldviews, and structures. So tribes were, again, since time immemorial, since the beginning of time, running these systems, caring for their communities without interference. And that includes education as well. And so I just like seeing these images kind of in juxtaposed with each other. And I think there's some, looks like folks are commenting. I just like that look because I feel like even today, colonialism is an active project, right? So despite history talking about treaty making, Indian wars, such and such, tribes are still nations and they're still operating despite the restrictions, the limitations, the intrusions by the federal government. And so colonialism is still operating today. And one way it does that is through subjugating tribal jurisdiction and tribal authority. And over time, these are some of the intrusions, the interference that the United States has done in disrupting tribal systems of governance and care. We've got straight out genocide, right? Which is we needed to get rid of these folks because we want the land here. And you have an era of treaties, which a lot of folks point to as a prime example, and which it is, a prime example of the nation-to-nation relationship. So these treaty-making processes that the United States entered into with tribes in the early starts of the United States really show that the United States treated tribes as nations. That's the relationship that you need to have when entering into treaties. And so it does point to the United States treating tribes in such a manner, but also it also really underscores that, and I put treaties in quotes because the process of treaty making was not always done in full faith. It was often facilitated land grabs. Many treaties were drafted but never ratified. So, it really does highlight a way that the United States has treated tribes as nations in the past, but also not really, right? Because they're not fully executing, giving them the respect that was due in those agreements. And there's tribes that are still fighting today for their treaty rights, including the Navajo Nation. There was just a recent water rights case that was up for SCOTUS review, looking at the treaty responsibility. and the scope of that to the Navajo, the federal government, to the Navajo Nation. Some other ones here that are highlighted: removal, reservation systems, allotment, and assimilation. As I mentioned, I'm zooming from Palm Springs and the Agua Caliente Band. Due to allotment and some of these other policies, their tribal lands are not contiguous. And so when you look at it on a map that's checkerboarded, where Indian lands were broken up and put up for sale to non-Indians. And then you have termination, boarding schools, quote unquote. Again, you can say it was schooling, and there's different experiences there, but it was an active tool of assimilation and a way to eradicate Indian identities. So we have all of these various forces, and this image is from a tribal coalition that focuses on ending violence in tribal communities. So I think there's just a ton that's been done to Indian people, but there's also been continued response, community response, active community response from tribal nations. But these are just some of the policies, not even all of the policies that the United States has enacted in their dealings with Native people. And as one of our participants mentioned earlier, there is a series of federal case law as well as statutes that affect tribal jurisdiction and authority. I just put some bullet points here: the Marshall Trilogy, Major Crimes Act, Oliphant, the Oliphant case, the Montana case. And again, this is where we see real subjugation of tribal authority to protect and also regulate the activities on their tribal lands. Oliphant was particularly damaging, which limited tribes' criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians committing crime in Indian country. So removing the inherent power that tribes had to punish folks anyone for doing crime in their communities. So you see some fixes to that Oliphant decision through the Violence Against Women Act, which was recently reauthorized last year in VAWA 2022, which returns or reaffirms and returns some tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians committing certain crimes. So again, these are just some highlights for you, some citations. There's plenty more that could be discussed, but we don't have time for that today. And so despite all of those intrusions, despite all of those efforts, tribes continue to exercise their sovereignty and really challenge those federal barriers and restrictions that have been put in place. And one way they do this is by determining their citizenry, right? So tribes determine who is or is not a citizen or member, just as the United States or any other government makes that determination. So that's a core function of being a political entity with that inherent authority, is to determine who is part of your community. And so tribal citizenship in that way is completely separate from and distinct from United States citizenship. And again, this is a process that exists whether or not a tribe has been recognized, unrecognized, non-recognized. There are ways for tribes to still determine who their membership is.
Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned too, this is a distinct difference from racial and ethnic identities. And I think so often when we're thinking about the Native American community, the default is to think of us as a racial category just like any other, and to ignore or maybe just being unaware of this unique distinction, political distinction that we have. As Native people, we often hear and we talk about how we're born into political identities because we're Native existing in the United States. But non-Native people don't have the burden of thinking about that or having to be aware of it. The default is that you're American, everyone's American, and if you're something other than that, it's a racial category.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge folks' comments as well. You're right; those are all. That was just an overview of past intrusions, but those are still active, right? So tribes are still actively trying to return to territorial jurisdiction, to enforce their treaty rights, to protect their children, to protect their languages. So all of that is still active. Those were just intrusions that are important to think about in examining how we got here and how tribal sovereignty is so misunderstood by the general public, but also folks in power positions. And so just to, to really hone in on tribal citizenship can be separate from cultural understandings of belonging. Citizenship has been impacted by colonialism and other systems of oppression as well. Tribal citizenship is distinct from other identities. Again, as Nora mentioned, it's different from race. There's also different and distinct definitions of who is an Indian person or a tribal person in various statutes. Some that come to mind include the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. So in the federal law and policy world, it has its own definitions of Indian that's often determined by these lawmaking materials. But they may align or are often inconsistent with tribal ways of kinship, right? So we have this big universe of Native identity that encompasses legal identity formations, but also tribal determinations of belonging and intermixed with that history of colonization and U.S. federal policy. And so we included this image from the Lakota People's Law Project, talking about how ICWA, the challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act, that was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court in this last term, could have had a domino effect on other rights and the relationship that the United States government has with tribal communities. And so you can see ICWA is the first domino there, and at the very end says Native sovereignty. Because when we think about ICWA in particular, those are ensuring protections for Indian children, the future of our nations. And so it was a very scary challenge. It was one that received resounding support from tribal nations across the United States, as well as other systems like the child welfare system, et cetera. But it really, ICWA, the main challenge, one of the challenges there were several constitutional challenges, but one of the main challenges in the ICWA case was that it was discriminatory based on race, and that Indian children were being disadvantaged or discriminated against by, that Indian children, again, were receiving special rights or special processes that weren't granted to other children. So the court did not touch that particular issue, kind of kicked the ball, punted the ball, because the parties did not have the correct standing to make that challenge. But we do know and expect that challenge will be made. And there's active efforts by groups, and you can see the Lakota People's Law Project here pointed out big oil here as the hand that's tipping over the dominoes, where that challenge we know is going to be coming down the line. But again, that case really reflects a core misunderstanding that tribal identity and tribal citizenship, and particularly for ICWA, children that are enrolled or eligible to be enrolled in federally recognized tribes, that is not a racial designation, but a political one. And I think Desiree put in a great resource, a podcast called This Land. It has a lot of great early background around the case. So thank you for sharing that, Desiree.
So we're going to get into a little bit about the history of Native higher education in the United States. But before that, I just wanted to just take a moment to think about why the institution of higher education exists. For what purpose does it exist in the United States? It's generally understood that it was to create or at least initially to create a educated class of elite who would be leaders of the country, basically in the United States, or prior to that, during colonial times. It expanded, of course, who would be considered part of that elite group, originally white men. It would expand to include women, people of other races, ethnicities, and it continued to expand. And it's kind of funny that a lot of people don't realize that early on, Natives were included in many of the charters of the colonial period institutions that were established. So again, if the institution of higher education in the United States is here to create a leadership class for this new budding country at the time, we also have to think then where does the relationship between the United States fall with sovereign tribes? the existence is, again, I remind people this all the time, the existence of the United States is in direct conflict with the existence of sovereign tribes that are on the land that the United States is wanting to occupy and have control over. So even to this day, long after the Indian Wars are done, our existence as members of federally recognized tribes or even of non-federally recognized tribes who have maintained an identity is in conflict with the existence of the United States, because our political claim to the land precedes the United States claim to it. So there, back in the day, it was the Indian problem. What are we going to do about the Indian problem as we're expanding westward? The Indian problem still exists. It's not as violent looking. It's a little bit different. It's taking different forms now, but that problem is still there. Ideally, the United States citizens would rather not have to deal with sovereign entities in the land that they view as theirs or rightfully theirs. So when there's an institution like higher education, that supports the United States claim to that land. So it's deeply rooted. You kind of really have to dig through and think about who we're trying to produce as leadership. So we're going to go through a few different periods, the colonial period, so anything prior to the American Revolution, and then the period of federal control, starting from the United States Revolution into about 1968, and then the exercising of tribal sovereignty in higher education with the start of tribal colleges and universities in 1968. So as I mentioned, some of the colonial period charters were really interesting, so I had a few here to share with you. This first one is from Harvard. So the purposes of Harvard College are the advancement of all good literature, arts, and sciences in Harvard College, in Cambridge, in the county of Middlesex, and to the maintenance of the president and fellows, and for all accommodations of buildings and all other necessary provisions that may conduce to the education of the English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and godliness. The next is William and Mary College. It has among its purposes that the Church of Virginia may be furnished with a seminary of ministers of the gospel, and that the youth may be piously educated in good letters and manners, and that the Christian faith may be propagated amongst the Western Indians to the glory of Almighty God. So I don't know if anyone recognizes some themes here, but that idea of using education as a tool of assimilation was, something that didn't start with the establishment of Indian boarding schools. It was, started far before that with the establishment of church schools, of these colonial period institutions of higher ed, and it continues throughout. And this is probably my favorite one, just because the way it's written sounds kind of funny. But Dartmouth College would exist for the education and instruction of youths of the Indian tribes in this land in reading, writing, and all parts of learning which shall appear necessary and expedient for civilizing and Christianizing children of pagans, as well as in all liberal arts and sciences, and also the English youth and any others. So it almost seemed like, anyone other than civilizing these pagans, it was an afterthought in Dartmouth. I don't know that that's entirely true, but the way it's written kind of sounds like that. But these, as I mentioned, this is stuff that people don't really talk about very much, and it wasn't until fairly recently that Native people in these institutions started to kind of pressure the universities to fulfill their charters and really put more resources into educating Native students in a more appropriate way for Native students today. And then after the American Revolution, the establishment of this country, as I mentioned, was in direct conflict with the existence of Native people and their sovereign identities. So tribal sovereignty was seen as something that needed to be controlled, erased, and ideally eradicated. And you'll see that with some acts, not just the laws that Heather had mentioned before and the acts that were passed that established the relationships between sovereign tribes and the United States, but specific to education, there's a couple important ones. The first is the Morrill Act, which was used for the sale of Indian land in the western half of the United States. And that the sale of that land was used to fund the endowments for 52 land-grant universities. It was also used as a tool to encourage settlers to move and occupy newly taken or newly acquired Indian land. And the other, of course, as I mentioned, is the establishment of Indian boarding schools. So in 1879, Carlisle Indian School was established with the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. Which again, this all kind of falls in line with, if we can't get rid of you physically, we will try to control you. We'll try to erase your identity. We'll take away what makes you Indian. And hopefully you will lose that connection and lose an understanding really of what your sovereign rights are within your tribal nations. And then in 1968, the first tribal college was established with Diné College, formerly the Navajo Nation Community College. And this was a really important time. It kind of kicked off after a lot of Native people who served during World War II came back, were able to take part in the benefits of the GI Bill and receive formal education in Western institutions. And tribes really, there was like a new wave of tribes exerting their sovereign rights. And part of that was saying, hey, you know, we have the right to educate our own citizens because the needs of our communities, it's different than what the needs are for the United States citizens. So Navajo Nation Community College, Diné College was established. And since then, I believe that this should be up to date, but 37 tribal colleges and universities and over 75 campuses exist now. And tribes control the curriculum, the hiring for all of these different institutions. So this is where I like to question, like, but what is the reach of exercising tribal sovereignty through TCUs? There's a large percentage of Native people who are educated in non-TCU institutions. Myself, I've never been a student of a tribal college. And so I did not get to receive the benefit of a curriculum that was established or formed for me as a Native person by my tribe or by a tribe that also shared similar sovereign rights. TCUs are also accredited by the same standards and boards that are used to accredit non-TCU institutions. In fact, I looked this up and I just wanted to double check, but I believe that there's two accreditation boards that cover the majority of tribal colleges. And one of them is the Higher Learning Commission, which I think is the same accreditation board that your institution uses. So if you think about that, although tribes have some control over the curriculum and how it's going to be taught, the standards used to accredit these institutions are still the same standards that are used by Western institutions. So the epistemology, the pedagogy that's being used needs to fall in line with those standards that are not stemming from or not rooted in tribal learning philosophies or tribal teaching philosophies. So even if you have the ability to, say, be raised in your tribal community, attend your tribe's tribal college, behind the scenes, if you dig deep enough, there's still this control or power that's being exerted somewhere along the lines from non-Native institutions, such as accreditation boards. And then the other thing too is that oftentimes this is shown as like eras of Native higher ed, a colonial era, a federally controlled era, and then, tribal sovereignty happened. Like, ta-da, we're here now. But in reality, the exercising of tribal sovereignty was happening in tribal colleges. All of those non-tribal colleges and universities that exist are still technically in the era of federal control. So that timeline doesn't stop. And I think now a lot of schools that are not tribal universities or colleges are trying to catch up and find ways of recognizing and allowing tribal citizens to exercise their sovereignty within their institutions. And because these conflicts between, again, the United States existence and the existence of tribes and how that has seeped into the establishment of higher education, because that conflict is so deeply rooted, it's difficult oftentimes for institutions to reflect on how they operate. And it's a lot of work. And sometimes when you try to do that work, it's like, well, that's not the way it's done. we have these policies, like where did the policies come from? How far back do we need to go and rework things? And it becomes a little bit frustrating, I think, for all parties involved, administrators, for Native people, Native staff, faculty, and students that are trying to operate in the systems as well.
All right, so this next section, we wanted to just dive in and kind of think about, so what are some of the ways that tribal sovereignty is being recognized or at least acknowledged within within higher education institutions? And so some things we thought about, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, departments, programs, one staff person, land acknowledgements, cultural and academic centers, development relationships, i.e. tribal philanthropy, tribal giving, and missions, Native American recruiters, and tribal liaison positions. And so there's probably more out there that we haven't identified or put up on the slide here, but these are just some initial attempts at recognizing tribal sovereignty. And I think even our folks in the room could probably speak to what some of where some of these initiatives or where some of these initial attempts fall short, right? So it's tough to do that work, like Nora said, when you're, as an institution, engaging in that work to be more informed, more relevant, more culturally appropriate and responsive to meeting the needs of the student population that you're seeing at your institutions. And so sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's best to do some of those easy steps, but the hard steps kind of take time. They take resources, and they also take commitment. Yeah, and this is really, to really do this well, it requires a paradigm shift. And paradigm shifts are never easy. They're oftentimes painful, and a lot of things will be brought up and need to be addressed. So it's not an easy thing to go through, and we recognize that. I think various things are listed here are getting close. I think tribal liaisons can get really close to doing the appropriate work, but oftentimes that evolves into more of a spokesperson on behalf of the institution to tribal communities, as opposed to a person that is bringing the concerns and needs of tribal communities to the institution and having the weight of speaking on behalf of sovereign nations when they're addressing administrators at the university or the institution level. So this is a fun meme. You can replace politicians with the university, but land acknowledgements is one that has become very popular, and it's great to be acknowledged. I think when the first time I heard land acknowledgements happening, I was like, oh my gosh, people know I exist. They know that we're still here. Although sometimes even that doesn't happen in the land acknowledgement. They'll speak of us as people and entities that exist in the past, or that the current people are just descendants of tribal nations. When in actuality, we are the continuance of that. We are still citizens of tribal nations. But I know the frustration that a lot of Native community feels is that once the acknowledgement is made, the institution can't feign ignorance at that point, because they've made a public statement saying, we know that we're on this land. We know that maybe the land was taken in a way that was not so nice. But that's it. There's no further step to do something else or to rectify that. So yeah. They can also get really sad. I heard one recently that was just really bad. Like unfortunately, I think it was during a graduation celebration, and folks were actually doing like an in memoriam. There were some students, unfortunately, that had passed away during the year, but they did that in the same breath as their land acknowledgement. And some of those sentiments that we kind of brought up earlier when we're talking about the education system and the lack of awareness or education around tribal government, or tribal nations as contemporary nations, it felt like the same. Doing it that way made it feel like, oh no, all tribal people are gone, but we're acknowledging them right now because we're here currently. And it still relegates Native people to the past. So it's really, you know, if folks are going to engage land acknowledgement, it's good to, you know, if you already got one, review it, you know, talk with your folks that you work with, your communities, your tribes that you work with to have some input in the creation of those acknowledgements. You know, it's something that's not an easy task to be done. And I think often too, sometimes what happens is, you know, okay, this is the thing to do now as an institution, like we've got to do these land acknowledgements now. The burden of that work, because it is work to go into the history and research and really think about the lands that the universities and the institutions are occupying. And often that can be placed on tribal staff. And that's the complete opposite around what taking the step of offering a land acknowledgement is even supposed to be intended, right? So you're then asking the Native person and putting the burden, the emotional labor, the time, the effort on the Native person to then acknowledge that the university they're working for is on the lands of other Native people, which is not, you know, with the land acknowledgements that's supposed to symbolize or the step towards, you know, the institution taking some sort of accountability and also initiates a relationship, right, to do better. So there's a lot of pitfalls with those ones, but that one was really egregious. So I just wanted to share that as a you know, note of fair warning. Like try and really think about and be purposeful about when and how the land acknowledgements are given.
Yeah, they should not be delivered like solemn eulogies. I've seen that happen quite a bit, and I know Heather and I have worked together at the University of Redlands. At the time, we were the two Native American staff members. I'm now the one Native American staff member. I do have some Native Hawaiian staff members too, though. But oftentimes that's the case. I get a lot of requests, last minute requests for land acknowledgements on behalf of offices or entities that I really don't have the ability to speak on behalf of. So I think that's the most important thing, is that if the university is giving a land acknowledgement, the highest administration should be the ones thinking about what does it mean, what are their sentiments, what are they trying to express when they give that land acknowledgement, not the one Native staff member. Because I don't know, you know, I don't know what it's like to be a president. If I was in that position, I would have to give the consideration of what it means to acknowledge that the land. So we wanted to, I know that we mentioned that there were some comments, but we wanted to kind of get some more feedback about some examples of sovereignty in action. So what's happening on your campus? What's the status of tribal relations on your campus? Are there DEI efforts that are inclusive of tribal issues and communities? And are there efforts that are outside of DEI that are in play?
Anybody want to comment besides me? Just kidding. Besides me, you know, I don't want to be the Native here. Just kidding. Okay, well, there is no tribal relationships. There isn't that government to government relationship with our institutions currently. I'm speaking for MSU. Dr. White Eagle could speak to CU Denver, but for MSU, unfortunately, we do not have that right now. I'm not trying to carry that burden because, as you said, like we are oftentimes the only one doing this work, right? And so a lot of times, not only are we in our professional roles, but we do play ante, we do play carpool, we do play the advisor, because Native students do want to come to somebody that looks like them and identifies as them, right? And so all these things, and that's what a tribal liaison's for. So if you want somebody to build those government to government relationships, you need to hire somebody who's going to do that exact work. And right now we don't have that at MSU Denver. Hopefully that's going to be a goal in the meantime, but at the same time, our institution is a lower income institution where it's more affordable to individuals who come from a lower income socioeconomic status, right? And so we don't have the funding as other universities throughout Colorado do, right? And so we have to think about those too, like just lack of resources and stuff, and how can we get those resources? But also, I think it is very important to be able to build those relationships here, because we do have a new tuition program. And with that, we are seeing an influx of Native students coming to campus, which is amazing. I love seeing all these students coming in, but what are we doing to better support them as they come here, right? And that means, you know, I would love to build a relationship with my tribal people back home, you know, because how can they help us build that bridge and that gap from them coming from tribal colleges to universities in the city? And how can we get more Native scholars, right, to be in these spaces and to, you know, pursue the things that they need to pursue for higher educational goals? As far as like the DEI efforts, I don't work in DEI. That's not my department. I'm more of like the student engagement aspect inside of things. So I can't speak to that. I won't speak to that. Maybe somebody else in the room may want to, but I don't have an answer for that. And then there are efforts outside of DEI in play, right? Like my role, I am the program coordinator for Native and Indigenous Student Support Services. I work under SASA, which is the, help me out, Cynthia. Center for Equity and Student Achievement. Sorry, all these acronyms, man. When you're in higher ed, I'm like, okay, this is another showboat over here, but it's like being in nursing school, I feel like. But anyways, no, and so I do a lot of student engagement, right? And I do a lot of collaborative work. We have a very unique institution here at Denver. We call it the Rarian campus. So we have Community College of Denver, CU Denver, and MSU Denver. And so we have 3 institutions, right, that are serving all of these students. And so my goal is to really build that collaborative effort in that community together. So I do a lot of work with Dr. White Eagle, and we do a lot of our programming together because that's what it needs to be. We are a small percentage of people that take up this space in these universities. So for my goal is to make sure that we build that community and show these students that it's okay that, yeah, we're at different institutions, but guess what? Like, we're here in community and we're here supporting you and bringing that programming. And like, I guess I'm only a year into this job, guys. Okay. So there's just that. But I think a lot has been accomplished within this last year. A lot still needs to be done. But a lot of my bosses, you know, they do listen and they are very intentional, and I do appreciate them being in this room with us today. That says a lot in itself. And so for me, I just hope that they can continue to show that support, not only by just showing up, but also bringing this conversation to other higher ups within this institution, right? And how can we build this programming and make this a good thing for our Native students, because they're coming and they're not going to stop, and they're going to continue to come, because once you put something out there that's going to help them better themselves, like, they will come and they will show up because they want to do better for themselves and for their people.
Can I add something to this? To Desiree's very first point. That if we have a tribal liaison person at MSU Denver, it shouldn't be any of Native staff that aren't working in the government office, because they are government officials and they should be treated as such. Us reaching out to chiefs or, current office members at reservations is fairly inappropriate, because we wouldn't just email the mayor. I mean, unless we know them, but you know what I mean. Or the governor or anything, and ask them to come to campus. That's something that should definitely be in government relations, because they are government officials.
I think that I can't speak on tribal relations, but I think on the DEI efforts of inclusive tribal issues, communities, and then the efforts that are within these things. Like, I'm a peer mentor and I work with a lot of students of diversity and trying to make sure that they all feel included, especially when it comes to the overall student body and then within the STEM as well. And I think what a lot of professors fail to see, and a lot of just staff as well, is that they're okay, cool, go to these resources, do this resource, but it's you don't understand how hard that is for us when you've stripped away our culture from this entire institution. So they set up these events and stuff in hopes of it's going to bring this sense of inclusivity to these students and give them a sense of exposure, give these other students a sense of exposure to their culture. But then you go to these field trips and you go to these places and they have no acknowledgement of how your people actually contributed to their existence there prior to that institution or that place, like Botanical Gardens or Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which we all know they have artifacts that should not be within their possession, you know what I mean? Or us, for that matter, you know what I mean? That came out last year. So it's there's constant trauma, but we can't continue to rely on our students to help solve these problems. They can be there for the input and the construction of the solutions, but there is no reason. We are students. We are struggling. And I'm sorry, but especially as STEM students, I really advocate for STEM students, because our degrees are very, very hard. Not to say that anybody else is in it. I just speak from experience, they're very tiring. And not to mention being constantly traumatized on a daily basis of how sorry to say, but some colonizer got the credit for the work that is put here that we've already established centuries before they even got here. So I think when it comes to that effort, it's there, and the conversations are finally being had about having to include Indigenous knowledge in our everyday structure. And a couple semesters back, I spoke with Dr. Makeley and a couple of other institutions that have grown their Native studies programs, right? And it's all about creating a demand for these classes. But the conversation, but it starts with the conversation. It creates with creating exposure to our Indigenous experts and that knowledge, and then being able to bring them in and recruit them, whether that be for a temporary class or those 2-week courses or the weekend courses, and then recruiting them to come in full time, get them on tenure track. Like Desiree said, our students, our Native students, are going to continue to keep coming when they see that we have the resources the resources they need to become successful. So, but we can't put that on the students. I think our professors, our staff, everybody needs to step up. You got these positions, you got these tenures, you got the health insurance. Like, we don't even get that benefit. You know what I mean? So I'm like, y'all have incentive to step up. They wanted change makers. We're here. We're doing what you asked us. We're becoming what you want us to be. How come you're not giving us that in return? How come we're not getting those benefits in return? You need to take down what change makers wanted if you're not going to benefit us and give us those incentive packages to become a change maker. You know what I mean? That's what it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. Heather and I both come from, we did our undergrad at UCLA, and we're involved with the American Indian Student Association, which is a very, it was a political student organization. And a lot of work did fall on students to push the institution to make moves to better support our communities. I think that students have a lot of power. I think that faculty that have tenureship have a lot of power. And basically everybody in the positions they are have a realm of control that they could be exerting and pushing boundaries in. Some of the best work, I think one of the most fulfilling things that Heather and I worked on was the establishment of the Furthering Indian Rights and Education coalition that we had at UCLA. And it was a group made up of community members, students, faculty, staff, and we all kind of worked together and used the powers that were available to us in those different positions to push the university to make some changes that were really necessary. But a lot of times it's not like that. A lot of times it does fall on students or the individual staff member out there that doesn't have the ability to fully implement the changes that need to happen. But the pressure is on them to do it regardless. And it is unfair.
I just want to add to that. There's so much I want to comment on. But first of all, so Dr. Roan commented, so she's also able to start helping. And like Desiree had mentioned, her and I are trying to create a community within the university here and also the University of Colorado over there in our UCD, because our community is really too small. And I really want to commend Antonio and Sam for being here. Thank you for, coming here and listening and educating yourselves about the issues here that we face as tribal people, because really it is like as Nora and Heather have said, it's a different Indian problem now, right? And these are just different issues that we have now, and the status of the tribal relations. I was really thankful that I came back on board as, your special assistant, and then, but really it should have just really stayed the position there. And I really would like to see that, continue. I'm really thankful that I'm still being able to fulfill that role. But what we've done, Nora and Heather, is, we've created a relationship with my own tribe, with the Arapaho, the Northern Arapaho, because these are the original homelands of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute. And so we've started to have conversations, and we've created an endowment with the Northern Arapaho, and we've created a historic scholarship for them. So that's kind of a beginning. But there's so much work, so much more work to be done. And it really does fall on all of us. And I mean, not on all of us, but I mean, we've got to start somewhere. And so I'm just really thankful for like Desiree bringing this here so that we can start having these conversations and start getting the ball rolling. And I know that we can sit here and kind of complain about things a lot, but thank you for showing us how we can start to get the ball rolling and the steps that we can take to start moving forward. Thanks.
I have something to say too.
Oh, okay.
So I think as a community, we fall short, as an Indigenous community, we fall short of growth and to grow is to heal and to spread that healing energy. And the other part of the university's issue is the money. Take the money out of the equation, because we never had money. With our people, our ancestors didn't operate on money. The only reason they have money is because of the land that they took. So I think if they have more effort into funding programs like this that we're trying to initiate, and create another program, to create another program, to build and build, to have that tribal sovereignty in the higher education. But they need money. And, you know, unfortunately, everything is money based in this day and age. But if we can take that out of the equation and look at things from a nonprofit perspective, you will get understanding. You will get relationship building. You will want that positive energy within both communities, since we both have to exist here in the higher education community. So we can't heal collectively, because not everybody is going to be on their healing journey at the same level at the same time. So I think that we have to go within ourselves as the Indigenous people individually and activate the healing process to overcome this trauma that we're all seriously pissed off about. You know, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because it really, and that's my healing that I need to get through, is to not get angry over something that could have been prevented and not covered up and not dismissed like it's, you know, tribal sovereignty to who? You know, we have sovereignty in different areas, not just financial, not just political, not just in higher education. Our thought process is different. Our healing process is different. Our people are the traditions. Where's the tradition at? If we bring that back into the higher education, that would help healing, that would help other non-natives to recognize what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. There are different worlds that we live in. We live in sometimes more than 4 worlds. As an educated Native American citizen of this land, there's a lot of worlds and a lot of hats that we have to put on and take off and throughout the day, living in an urbanized community as well. And, you know, versus the reservation community and their education systems on their reservations. It's totally different than the education system out here in the urban areas. So I think we just need to make those bridges, you know, and connect everything to help growth, because that's where we're lacking.
We're running short on time here. We only have like 10 minutes. So obviously this can open a can of worms for us as Native people, right? And there's like so much to discuss, and we can't get it all in an hour and a half, and everybody has to go to their things. But I just wanted to let you talk about what you need to talk about real quickly, Nora and Heather, and then if we could just get a couple comments in the chat too.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what was being shared just now. That's something that's really important to understand too. For your Native students, your Native staff, your faculty, if you're lucky enough to have a tribal liaison at like a cabinet level position, no matter who it is, as a Native person, you can't leave that identity at the door when you step into those roles to do the work that you need to do. So when you're asking Native students, staff, faculty, administrators to do something, they're feeling the full force of the arrows that are being thrown at them. As a Native person, you know, they still feel that. They still feel the hurt, the pain, the anger, the rage. I don't know how many times I've come home from work and I'm just so angry about things that happen. But, you know, we have to do the emotional and effective labor to be able to communicate the things to the non-Native people that we work with. But that work goes unseen and unrecognized. So for the non-Native people, if you're serious about doing this work, always think about that. Think about, you know, the unseen work that Native people are having to do just to engage in these conversations in an institution that is not built to sustain and maintain their identity, but is, you know, has roots that are actively harmful to that identity. Just a quick note, but yeah, we do have an example of one step that an institution here at the University of California is making to recognize tribal sovereignty. They have recently included a question about tribal citizenship separate from the demographic data of race and ethnic information that they collect. So they'll ask, are you a United States citizen? Are you an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe? If so, which one? And that's completely separate. And this is so important because oftentimes we run into very bad data. And as we were talking about before, a tribe's ability to decide their citizenship and to recognize the members of their nation, that's a foundational exercise in sovereignty. And for an institution to not share that understanding and to recognize it through how they're collecting information and what they're reporting means that it doesn't matter how you identify yourselves, because we're only going to see you as a race or ethnic category, and we're going to also lose you in the 2 or more races category. So we're going to have horrible data, and it's your problem, not ours, because we have federal standards that we're implementing. So that's a pretty clear step forward. It's a small step. But in some ways, it's a very big step because data is something that we're always fighting with. And then I know that we have to get through really quickly. We had a couple of things that we wanted people to kind of think about as you're walking away from this. We've probably heard a lot about white fragility when matters are brought up discussing racism or anti-racism. But there's also settler fragility. So this is a step deeper because it's not limited to the racial categories that people oftentimes think of and rely on, but the identity of Native people versus settlers. And most people don't ever think about what that relationship is and what identity they embody, unless you're a Native person. If you're a Native person, you think about that all the time. You're born into this political identity. You know that you have a tribal ID card, and there's blood quantum rules and whatnot that are all applying to you, but non-Native people don't consider that. So to be aware of that when getting ready to take on this work is important. And then we have another resource here. There's great questions about unpacking settler privilege. Again, goes into that settler fragility. We can share some of the links and the resources too later after this. And through email. We have time to play the last little clip. This is a callback.
And Jesse Jackson held a news conference, and he was questioned by Brent Merrill of the publication Smoke Signals.
As you saw today at the President's conference, the leader of the free world does not understand tribal sovereignty. What would you do, in your estimation, Reverend, what would you do, and how would you advise tribes to educate our folks just exactly what tribal sovereignty is?
The president explained. You just didn't understand. Sovereignty is sovereign. You understand? It's like in sovereignty. If you're on the reservation, you've been sovereigized. Your PhD is in sovereignization. You understand? I mean, I don't think you understand.
You're right. I didn't understand that.
Well, needless to say, that the sovereignty of Native American tribes are federally protected rights.
So that was just, we did a little callback, but yeah, he summed it up pretty good at the very end. Simply put, they're federally protected rights.
Not given, protected.
Yeah, protected. And this is just a little meme I thought we'd share. But with whatever remaining time we have left, let's go ahead and use it.
Awesome. Thank you, Nora and Heather, so much for bringing this conversation to our campus and just, really educating us. This is being recorded, everybody, so I can share it with Dr. White Eagle, and Dr. White Eagle, you can share it with Sam and, Antonio, sorry. And whoever else you feel that you need to share it with, I'll share it with everybody too. I know it's going to be on DeFi website as well. But I know there were some things and that's the thing about natives, right? I love us as Native people because yes, we are seen as these stoic, serious people, but I love our humor. I think our humor is what gets us through all of our trauma and all the things that we have to endure as Native people. And that just, people just, I don't know. I love our humor and being with other natives. I'm yes, now I can anti-laugh and now I can laugh at the jokes that other people are why are they laughing? But we all get it, right? But I know there's a lot of comments in here. Let's see. Yeah.
There's a question about online students getting more involved, which I think is a great consideration, especially for the institution of your type, right? And then especially hearing about the incentives that you're now offering in terms of recruiting more Native students to your institution. Now that you're going to get them, now that you're calling for them, you're going to get them. And you can't just, sprinkle a little tribal issues in your DEI or sprinkle a Native American Heritage celebration and feel like you are serving those students better, right? You're going to have to ask the hard questions and talk to your staff, talk to your students about what can be improved, and then be ready to put the resources and the resources and the power, the time, the money towards making those efforts now that incentive is being offered for Native students.
Yeah, so does anybody online have any want to ask any questions? We'll take a couple questions.
Or anybody in person.
Or anybody in person?
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to point out that I wish that there was more resources for those of us who are trying to find out more about ourselves, if that makes sense. Like, there's some of us who, like, I wasn't able to ever have the privilege because it was taken away from my grandparents to give to my mom. And none of us know anything about our culture, if that makes sense. I wish there was more of like that kind of communication to go out there to just discuss, like, hey, like, you guys lost this out. I feel like it's hard for us because it's very intimidating in the fact of, like, when you go to register for something and they say, hey, what are you? Well, you can't say you're Native American because you're not registered. But in context, I am. I just can't help it that my family got completely cut off. And because, like, in the 80s, they were told it was a bad thing to even say you were associated. So I don't know if there's any way to get those kind of resources in class, or like those kind of.
So I can interject. I mean, so there's resources. If you go to the Native American Rights Fund, there is actually a way you can start doing they have resources where you can go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they have all of that information there at the Native American Rights Fund. And then I can send you that link.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, and like, I know he's in the same boat as me, but it's like, for us, it's just the conversation of even getting to know where we come from. It's nothing to do with any of that.
It says it all right there. Yeah. But I'm sorry, I don't mean to take away from you, Heather or Nora, but they have, you might have some more resources, but I've had those conversations with other students, so I just have that.
Oh, and thank you for sharing. Go ahead, Nora.
I was just going to say that, what the experience that you're talking about is not uncommon within the Native community, and I think part of the healing process that we were talking about earlier is understanding why we have the identities that we have and why we may feel some discomfort through that. There was reason, there were, as we mentioned, there were acts, there were efforts that were done to remove you from those identities. And it's not through fault of your family or through your fault that you don't have those, but to come to terms with that. And also on the other end, for those of us who do have, I feel very privileged to be able to know, I come from what tribe I come from, to know the clans that I come from, to know even the little bits of my language that I do know, but to also have some understanding and some compassion for our relatives that weren't given those opportunities and why those were taken away from them. So, it's a long process, and there is, part of that is being in community with each other and having those conversations and kind of making those connections and unpacking a lot of the history there. So,
yeah, and thank you so much for sharing. And I think it goes to, in terms of the university efforts to be a better space, like making sure your staff and faculty are aware of these types of issues, aware of this history, aware that students may come to them with these questions, have the university create a resource list that can help students. There are things that the university can do as well to make sure that every staff member and faculty that they interact with, not just the Native staff person or the Native admissions recruiter, is able to at least make even if they aren't from the same community background, that they are at least able to offer support and be of assistance and be a kind of a safe landing place for those questions. So thank you so much for sharing. And I think that we're at time with that.
Yeah, we are at time. Thank you both so much for being here. I know you all have things to do as well. And so I really appreciate you just having this conversation with us and really trying to really just, educating us a little bit more. And maybe this is something we can expand on, in the future and stuff, because this is not the end of it. Like, we need to continue having these conversations and doing this work because we are trying to be an institution that's Native serving, right, and Indigenous serving. And so we can't just have these conversations in an hour and a half, unfortunately. But yes, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting us. It was a lot of
Yay.
fun.
Thank you so very much,
Thank you,
ladies.
Heather.
Please feel free to share my contact information if anyone wants to reach out.
Yes, I
here.
will. Thank you.
Same here.
Thank you, everybody,
y'all
for coming today.